Are you looking for a modern, up-to-date course for learning PHP programming? If so, you found it. Hey there, I'm Mark Schust, and I've been a PHP programmer for over 20 years. I remember being so intimidated the first time I picked up a book on PHP, a physical book. There was so much crazy terminology in it, and it assumed I already knew all of these crazy different programming concepts. And it was so hard to understand the material that I just got so frustrated, put down the book, and walked out of the Borders bookstore. Well, that's definitely aging myself a bit, but PHP has come a super long way since then, and it's grown to be the most used server-side programming language in the world, even though it's been declared dead about 1 million times. If you are thinking about learning PHP today, I don't think there's ever been a better time to do it. It's had lots of improvements over the years, including many language level features and speed enhancements, that it's absolutely still my go-to backend programming language. I took all of the little tidbits and concepts I have learned over all of these years and condensed them down into a couple hours of straightforward, no fluff lessons and tutorials. If you ever want to reference or leave a comment on an individual lesson, track your course progress, or watch them with tech-friendly closed captions in either English or Spanish, consider registering for the M Academy library for free at m.academy/library. I mainly teach and focus solely on creating material for Magento, which is an e-commerce platform built on PHP. But from time to time, I do cover related topics such as PHP, JavaScript, Docker, and more. Good luck with the course, and if you like it, remember to hit that like button to support my channel. Thanks so much, and enjoy.
Install PHP with Homebrew. Let's go to the official PHP docs at php.net and click the documentation tab at the top, and then click English to view the online documentation. If we scroll down, we will see a link for installation and configuration. And we'll see install docs for Linux or Unix, Mac, as well as Windows. This tutorial assumes you are on a Mac, but if you have another OS, feel free to install the instructions for that specific OS. PHP used to be included on macOS, but Apple removed that binary from all versions of macOS, starting with Monterey. But this is no problem. I actually never much liked the built-in PHP version because it always seemed that when newer versions were released, it was always hard to switch back and forth between the older and newer versions. Under installation on macOS, let's click this Using Packages link. And within here, we will see a reference to Homebrew. Let's go ahead and follow this link to brew.sh. This is the homepage for Homebrew, and this is just a great package manager for macOS. Homebrew provides the ability to easily install software packages on macOS that would otherwise be a bit difficult to install, like PHP. So let's install Homebrew by going ahead and copying this line to the clipboard. Open up your terminal prompt and paste it in. The Homebrew install script will ask for your system password. This is completely normal. So let's go ahead and type this in. And we'll see that Homebrew installs a lot of files at the /opt/homebrew directory. This is totally okay. Let's go ahead and tap enter again. And Homebrew will download and install a ton of different packages from different repositories. Homebrew will also tap specific repositories, meaning that it makes it available to install packages within those specific repositories. And it looks like Homebrew is now installed, but we will see this warning that says opt Homebrew bin is not in our path. But instructions on how to configure your shell are in the next steps below, which is right here. So we need to execute these two commands to add Homebrew to our path. This opt Homebrew bin brew script is a special script which adds the opt Homebrew bin directory to the system path. This makes all binaries installed with brew available at your terminal prompt. So let's copy this first line and paste it into our terminal window. And we will do the same with this second line. After these two commands are executed, brew should be completely installed. And we can confirm this by typing which brew. And this will give us the path of the brew binary. And we can also execute brew, and we should see some output that looks just like this. Our next step is to install PHP, and we can do this with brew by running brew install PHP. This will install the most recent version of PHP, which at the time of this video is PHP 8.1. It will take a little bit of time to download all of these packages, so just be patient. Any other dependencies that are needed to run PHP are also downloaded and installed at this time. Once the install script completes, we have information of how to find the PHP ini file, as well as how to restart the PHP services. For most, if not all of these lessons, we will just be using the PHP binary. This doesn't rely on a service and is accessible by just typing in PHP in the command line. And we can pass any sort of flags to this PHP command, including -v, which tells us the version of PHP that is installed. And if you see output like this, it means we are all set and we are off to the races to start coding up some PHP. Install a PHP IDE editor. There are many different options when it comes to setting up a PHP editor. PHP is so simple that you can even use a plain text editor such as Notepad, TextEdit, or Command Line. Even though I still use Command Line and Vim to edit files a lot, I'm almost always coding in a full-blown editing program. In order to gain syntax highlighting, real-time error notifications, suggestions for code fixes, or many other benefits, you'll need a real IDE or integrated development environment for coding up your PHP programs. The two most popular editors in the PHP world are VS Code and PHP Storm. VS Code has been really making ground and seems to be preferred by many new PHP developers because it loads very quick, and best of all, it's completely free. You can go to code.visualstudio.com to download and install it for your platform. I still very much prefer JetBrains PHP Storm though because it's so fully featured. As soon as you get into more complex PHP code and need to debug code with Xdebug, step into parent classes, plug in some advanced editor configuration or some other plugin, PHP Storm is without a doubt the best in-class PHP editor. I'll be using PHP Storm throughout this course just so you know, but you can feel free to follow along in VS Code or any other PHP editor. You will not need a full-blown editor to take this course. Once PHP Storm is open, go ahead and create a new project. You will select this PHP empty project toggle, and I store all my projects within my local sites directory. I will just call this app my PHP. After that's set, PHP Storm will be open to that my PHP directory, and you are ready to start coding. Start the built-in PHP web server. Usually when you are building a website, you'll have a web server such as Nginx or Apache that sits in front of the PHP service. Then some configuration needs to be added so that web server can properly serve web requests to handle PHP files. You'll definitely want to set up this external server / PHP combo on production sites, but right now we just need to learn PHP. So we'll use a much simpler method. Use the built-in PHP web server. You'll want to first open up Terminal. You can do this right on your host with the Terminal app, or if you are using PHP Storm, you can go to View, Tool Windows, Terminal. And we can see that this works the same way as the normal Terminal app. Let's call the PHP binary again, but this time passing in the --help argument. This gives us the available arguments we can pass to this PHP script. One of those being the -S command, which runs the built-in PHP web server. This argument expects an address port combo to be passed in after the -S flag. So let's go ahead and call PHP -S And the address here will always be localhost since we are running it on our own machine, followed by a colon, followed by any available port. Note that you cannot use any port lower than 1024, as those are considered privileged ports that require higher security privileges. It's common to use port 8000 for this built-in web server. The default port for web servers is 80, so just adding a couple zeros at the end makes this easy to remember. Now that we have our web server started, we can visit this localhost 8000 address in our web browser, and we'll see a not found page. Don't worry, this is actually great. This purple background at the top lets us know that the built-in PHP server is serving up this request. And if we check out our terminal again, we will see that there is some output to the console here showing the web server accepting the request, serving it up, and then closing out this web request. Now that you have your editor set up and a web server running, it's time to start writing some PHP. Create a Hello World PHP script. It's finally time for our Hello World script. So first, our PHP web server expects to receive a file named either index.html or index.php. Since .html files cannot parse PHP, we will need to use this PHP extension instead. So let's go ahead and create a new file within our project named index.php. Wherever we wish to write PHP code, we must use an open PHP tag. This is created with an open bracket or less than sign, followed by a question mark, and then PHP. There can't be any spaces between the characters, it has to all be together. Now that we've created a PHP tag, we can call any language construct or built-in function of PHP. A language construct is just a fancy phrase for something that makes up the base of the PHP language. Probably the most commonly used language construct is echo, which outputs data. Let's type echo followed by a open and close parentheses. And within the parentheses, we can pass in any data we'd like output to the screen. This data we pass in is called an expression, and it is evaluated at the time the PHP script is executed. Let's just pass in a string, which is always enclosed within quotes. And we could type any characters within these two single quotes. So let's type hello world. Finally, we can close up this PHP tag by leaving a space and then typing another question mark followed by an open bracket or greater than sign. This tells the PHP interpreter that we no longer have PHP code executed after this closing bracket. And let's save this file and go ahead and refresh our page, and we will see our hello world message. Closing tags, semicolons, and line breaks in PHP. Note that if we look in the corner of this PHP storm, we'll see there is a weak warning. And if we off select this closing tag, we'll see there is a green squiggly that says there is a redundant closing tag. This is because our PHP script only contains PHP code, and it's best to remove the closing PHP tag in this situation. We do this because any white space or new lines added after the closing PHP tag can cause some unwanted side effects and errors in certain situations. But once we remove that closing bracket, we'll see that PHP Storm gives us a hard warning now, denoted by this red squiggly. It says expected semicolon, and this is an error that will cause our script to fail. We can confirm this by saving this script and refreshing our page. This is because when we use a closing bracket, it implies that our PHP script has ended. Now that we've taken this closing tag away, we now need something to tell PHP that we are done writing PHP code. So all we need to do here is add a semicolon to the end of this line. Now if we save and refresh the page, everything's working again. This error may seem a bit silly, but semicolons really do play an important role in PHP in something called instruction separation. This is just a fancy way for us needing to tell PHP where one line of code ends and another begins. Before we add some more lines to our script, let's talk about line breaks. It's great to have everything on its own line because it makes code reviews a lot simpler when you are comparing code from one version to a new version. Also, if you have some developers editing in command line and some not in command line, sometimes these terminal apps automatically add a new line to the end of scripts. So it's just a good idea to always suffix every one of your PHP files with an empty new line. Back to our semicolons, let's go ahead and duplicate out this line and add in a couple exclamation marks. Before PHP actually executes this code, it compiles it down and strips out all of the white space and line breaks. This means that this code will look more like this. And if we didn't have semicolons, let's take them out. This is how it would appear to the PHP compiler. Again, PHP would be unable to determine where one line of code ends and another begins. And if we go ahead and save this file and refresh, we can see a demonstration of that. So by adding back in those semicolons, PHP can determine all of this at runtime and execute our script successfully. Alternate method of calling PHP language constructs. This is a minor note, but while echo looks like a function call, it is actually instead considered a language construct. That is a piece of code that makes up the PHP language. You can actually write this line another way. Rather than wrapping the string in parentheses, you can actually just eliminate them. Just leave a space between echo and the string, and the output will be exactly the same. There are many other language constructs. Some require parentheses and some do not. There are no performance implications of using either method, so you can use whatever you wish. You also don't need to memorize these because I'd recommend using parentheses absolutely everywhere anyways, as it will make your code easier to read and understand. There is one exception though, and that is probably the echo construct. Since this construct is used so often and usually deals with outputting strings, I'd say it's actually easier to read through echo statements if they do not use parentheses. So this is the approach I take. Everything uses parentheses besides echo. Write short echo tags in PHP. Before we go any further, did you know that you can mix and match HTML and PHP? Let's consolidate this PHP tag to one line and go ahead and close up this PHP tag. And then we will wrap this within an H1 header tag. If we save it and go ahead and refresh the page, we will see our echo is now wrapped within an H1 tag. That's pretty cool. Since using this open PHP tag along with an echo statement is so common, PHP created a shorthand syntax for doing this called a short echo tag. Rather than typing a normal PHP tag, we can actually replace this PHP and the echo with an equal sign. When we use this open bracket question mark equal sign syntax, we are essentially saying PHP echo. And finally, since these short echo tags are always closed up right away with a closing PHP tag, this tells PHP that the execution is complete. Because of this, we also don't need the semicolon, so let's go ahead and remove that. I never use semicolons with short echo tags because it just makes things a lot cleaner and easier to read. So wasn't this update pretty neat? Let's go ahead and save this and refresh the page, and we will see everything still outputs exactly the same. So this short echo tag is exactly equivalent to the same PHP echo statement that we used before. When you have the option to use two different pieces of code, always opt for the version that is the shortest and doesn't sacrifice readability. Less code almost always leads to fewer bugs because it makes your code easier to reason about when it comes time to debug code that isn't working. So when presented with these two options, I always opt for the short PHP echo tag. Create and name variables in PHP. Every programming language has the concept of variables, and they're used anytime you wish to store data and then reference it somewhere later on in your code. PHP variables always start with a $sign. Let's create a new variable for a fictitious blog we will be creating. We'll do that by opening up another PHP tag at the start of our script. And then we will create a title variable. And let's set it equal to my blog. We can put all of this code on one line, but usually when I create variables, there is additional code that will eventually make its way into this script. So I always use multiple lines when defining variables. And remember that we need to use a semicolon here because we are not within a short tag and our script isn't completely PHP. And let's change this hello world to the reference of our variable $title. Now, when we save this file and refresh the page, we will see my blog outputted. Note that the name of this variable title is completely arbitrary. It can be whatever we wish, but variables cannot start with a number. We will see that PHP Storm complains that it is invalid. And it also can't contain any odd characters or other characters within the variable. A good IDE will throw some sort of flag or error warning so you know this code cannot be compiled before you go ahead and save it. If you would like your variable to contain more than one word, for example, my title, you can either use snake case, which is all lowercase, and words separated with an underscore, or you can also use camel case with the first word lowercase and all subsequent words uppercase. Whichever format you use is completely up to you. Some prefer snake case because it's generally easier to read, while others prefer camel case because it more closely aligns with how JavaScript variables are named. I personally prefer camel case, but whichever you choose, just pick a format and stick with it so you don't drive your coworkers or other people dealing with your code crazy. For now, I will just set this variable back to title because it's the most straightforward name at the moment for this variable. PHP data type assignments. Note that we didn't assign a data type when we created our title variable. This is because PHP is considered a loosely typed language. In most other languages, you would need to define title as a string at the place the variable assignment takes place. Let's create a new p tag, and within it we will use a short echo tag. And we will display the result of a call to get type, which is a built-in PHP function. And let's pass in the title variable as an argument to this function. Now when we save and refresh the page, we will see that it is the type of string. Let's create another new variable named numPosts. I generally really dislike using abbreviations in my code, but num is very common, and simple variable names make your code a bit easier to read. Let's set it equal to 10. And let's output this within a new h2 tag. In a short echo tag, we will output numPosts, and then go ahead and close up the tag. Now when we save it and refresh, we will of course get 10. And let's again output the type of this variable. I'll just copy and paste this p tag and then pass in numPosts. And now when we refresh, we will see it is of type integer. Note how we didn't strictly define a data type when creating either of these variables. Based on the value of the variable at the time they are created, PHP infers the data type that it should be and automatically assigns it for us. That's super cool. I'm going to go on a little tangent about the getType function because I didn't really talk about it. Note that getType is actually a built-in PHP function and not a language construct. I'm going to expand this PHP Storm window just a little bit, and let's command click in to this getType function. On Windows or Linux, it's control click, and this will take us to the place that this function is defined. We can read the signature of the function to find out exactly what types of variables we can pass in and what is returned. And if we scroll up, we will see a doc block with some additional info. This includes the description of the function and a link to additional data on php.net's website. If we command click or control click on Linux or Windows, we will get sent to full documentation of the function on PHP's documentation website. This is a bit easier to read than the doc block and contains all of the additional info related to this function, along with a changelog of when this function was potentially introduced or changed, and examples of how this function is used, along with related functions. There are thousands of built-in functions in PHP, so this documentation is extremely helpful. Don't be concerned about memorizing all of these functions though. I've been programming in PHP for over 20 years and I probably only know a fraction of them. You will slowly become familiar with more functions as you need them and use them, and as you continue to work more with the language. We'll touch base on quite a few more built-in PHP functions later in this course. Typecasting in PHP. Let's say that we didn't like how PHP assigned a string for the title and an integer for the number of posts. Even though that's exactly what we wanted, just follow along for a moment. We are able to cast variables as different types at the time they are created. This forces these types to be the exact type that we specify. We can do this by adding a parentheses before our variable assignment, and then specifying the type we wish to cast this variable to inside the parentheses. So for example, let's say we wanted this to be an integer. We can type integer and then save this file. And when we refresh the page, we'll see that something happened. PHP took the string, and since it was cast to an integer, it converted that string to the closest representation of that it could, which here is a 0. We will notice that the call to getType also changed to confirm this variable is now in fact an integer. Let's do the same for numPosts, but we will make it a string instead. When we refresh the page, this time the only thing that changed is the data type. This is because PHP basically just wraps our integer in quotes. This is also what PHP Storm is complaining about, that cast can be replaced with 10 in quotes. Well, we already know that, but this is a good demonstration of what's going on here. You can cast a variable to the many data types of an integer, Boolean, float, string, array, object, or you can cast it to null with the unset keyword. Note also from this screenshot that there are shortcuts for integer and Boolean as int and bool, respectively. It's actually more common than not to see these shorter abbreviations when referencing data types. So let's change our integer to int, and we can see that it has the same output. Type juggling or coercion in PHP. PHP has generally gotten a bad rap for something known as type juggling. If you attempt to combine multiple different data types together, either on purpose or by accident, the data types are automatically converted from one of the data types to the other, known as juggling. This provides a sort of fallback mechanism for those new to PHP, but it can be pretty dangerous if depended upon in larger apps because it can lead to undesired output. Let's remove the typecast on both of these variables so they are instead using PHP's automatic data type assignment. And when we save and refresh the page, we are seeing our expected output. I'm going to use a couple weird examples right here just for demonstrating how type juggling can work. Let's multiply our numPosts by 10, and then we will wrap our 10 within single quotes, essentially making it a string. If we save and refresh the page, we'll see something interesting. You'd probably expect an error to be outputted here, but instead, PHP uses data coercion or juggling to come up with a reasonable guess of what the output should be. When you are creating dependable web apps, you don't really want to be relying on reasonable guesses. You want to be 100% sure that what you expect to happen will in fact happen. Let's elaborate on this just a bit more by saying that this first number in numPost is also a string. And when we refresh our page, nothing changes, it's still 100. This seems a bit odd because we are multiplying a string and a string. But PHP assumes that since you are using this math operand of multiply, that each of these values should in fact be a number. Okay, but let's take it a step further and add these strings together rather than multiply. Let's save and refresh the page, and this sort of still holds up. But let's do something a bit different. Let's use a period here instead of a dot. We haven't learned this quite yet, but this is how you join two strings together. And when we refresh the page, we don't get a number, we get a string. So rather than converting these two strings to integers and then adding them together, both of these values remain strings and then they are concatenated together. But I'm sure this 1010 output is probably not the output that you expected to see. Later on, when we get to functions, we can actually enable something in PHP called strict mode, which will help prevent situations like this. But we'll learn more about that later. Concatenating strings in PHP. You can join together one or many strings in PHP, and there are a few ways to do it. As we learned in this last lesson, we can convert two strings together using a period, also known as a concatenation operator. But for the sake of this lesson, and so we don't start getting confused, let's set this num posts back to 10, which is an integer. Let's also remove these calls to getType because we no longer need them. First, if we want to display text right alongside this integer here, the easiest way to do this is outside of the PHP tag. So let's go ahead and type posts after this num post is outputted. And when we refresh the screen, we will see 10 posts. But sometimes you will want to be able to do this programmatically. So let's create a new variable that manages the display of this text of number of posts. We will name this new variable num posts display, and we will set it equal to the contents that are outputted within this h2 tag. So let's assign it the value of num posts concatenated with posts. Remember to add the space here so the number is separated from the text. Remember that using this concatenation operator of a period makes both of these sides strings, so this num post is automatically converted to a string. We can then output the data within this short echo tag, num post display, and then remove our extra posts text. And when we refresh the page, the same output will be shown. There is another way to join strings together, and that's by using what's called a combined operator. If we ever wish to assign the value that we are setting here over multiple lines, this is when we will use this method. For example, rather than concatenating on this post text, let's just set this to num posts. Then we will break posts out to another line, and we will do this again by calling num post display, but setting it equal to this post string will actually overwrite our previously existing variable. So instead of using an equal sign, we will use a period equal sign. And when we save and refresh, the output is the same. This is more of a procedural programming approach though, which means it runs through multiple lines using a top-down approach. There's actually another way to write this code as well. Instead of using a period equal sign here, we can actually use a period and then remove the previous semicolon. This is essentially the same as wrapping it all on its own line, but using multiple lines can sometimes be useful depending on how you are working with the code. For now, we will just set this to a single line because it's easier to read. String interpolation and escaping in PHP. Now that we've learned about concatenating strings, there's yet another way to combine multiple variables together, and that's using something called string interpolation. This can be useful when dealing with strings that need to be output similar to this num post display variable, where we are combining two values together with a space. It can be a bit difficult to understand how this string will be formatted since we have a space within one of these outputted values and there is a space on either side of this period. Let's surround this entire variable assignment within double quotes. And then we will remove the single quotes as well as the period. And wow, it's pretty easy to tell how this string will be formatted now, right? And when we refresh the page, nothing changes. This isn't possible when we use single quotes, but when we use double quotes, we can interpolate, which means we can evaluate a variable defined within a string. This can greatly simplify the cognitive load when dealing with strings that are to be outputted. If we wanted special characters within this string, we can escape them with a backslash. For example, if we wanted to surround this number 10 within double quotes, we can enter a backslash here to escape this string and then enter our special character, which is a double quote. And we will do it again after this variable. And when we save and refresh, we will now see our string and our number 10 enclosed in double quotes. Create a constant in PHP to store a fixed value. We've defined a variable, but we haven't yet changed the value of it. Variables are meant to be changed or updated at any time. For example, we can change this number of posts by creating another numPost variable and adding 10 to the previous value. So when we go ahead and refresh this page, it will output 20, which reflects the updates we made to this variable. This is sort of a silly example, but you will without a doubt have increasingly complex calculations going on somewhere in your code eventually. Variables are meant to be modified or updated, but sometimes you want to make sure a value never changes. In this case, you can assign the value to a constant rather than a variable. There are two types of constants: global constants and local constants, also known as class constants. Global constants are set with the define function and are executed at runtime. For this reason, they cannot be used within classes, which require the use of local constants. You don't know about classes yet, but we'll touch base on them a little bit later. Let's create a new global constant here with the define function. Define accepts two arguments, the first being the name of the constant, which is common convention to use upper snake case. And we will pass this in as a string named min num posts. And the second parameter is the value we wish to assign to the constant. So we will just set this to 0 for now. And we can output and use this just like a variable. So let's create a new h3 tag, and let's use a short echo tag to output min num posts. And note how we call that without a $sign because it's a constant. And just so we know what this is, let's prefix this with minimum and a colon. And when we save and refresh, we will see that the value is outputted just like a variable. Now at this point, we can't duplicate this line and assign another value to it. If we do that, we will get a notice from PHP that says the constant is already defined. This is great because we can enforce the integrity of this value at all times. Since we pass the name of this constant as a string, that means constants defined this way can use something like string interpolation to create dynamically named constants, and they can even be defined within loops. Since the define function is executed at runtime, that means they can also be used within if statements, which we will get to a little later on. Any value, including advanced data types, can also be assigned using define. This differs from the const keyword, which is used to define local constants. The const keyword has received increased functionality over the years and has a simpler and easier to read syntax. We can create local constants using const just like PHP variables. Let's create another constant underneath this min num post, and we will use the const keyword. And let's name this max num posts. This naming convention uses the same upper snake format, just like the define function. But we can just set this equal to a value. Let's set this equal to 100. And just like the define function, we can specify a maximum and output it just like our other constant. Now when we refresh the page, we can see that it outputs as expected. Note that creating a local constant looks a lot like defining a regular PHP variable. This format was initially created for classes, but since defining a constant like this is a lot simpler and easier to read than using this define function, it's now the preferred method of creating constants. If one of these class constants is created within a class, it's only accessible and available within that class. We will learn more about classes later. It's worth noting that the const keyword cannot be used within if statements or loops since it's executed at compile time and not runtime. That means there is still some precedence for using the define function instead of const for specific scenarios. Create a Boolean variable in PHP. If you aren't yet familiar with Booleans, they're basically a way to toggle 1 or 0 to determine if a variable is true or false. We won't be using our constants anymore, so let's go ahead and remove them. And let's create a new variable named hasPosts. You can name Booleans whatever you want, but it's a great convention to prefix them with either an is or a has. This self-documents this variable as a Boolean, which can be helpful in this loosely typed language. And let's set this equal to true. Before we continue any further, let's learn about another very frequently used PHP function called var dump. This function dumps the output of a variable to the screen, and it differs from other commands because it dumps out more verbose information about a specific variable or expression. Let's open a PHP tag and run var _dump, and we will pass in hasPosts. And then we will close up this PHP tag. And when we refresh the screen, we will see that not only the value of the variable is outputted, but also the data type. This can be extremely useful when debugging our code. Also note how I didn't use a short echo tag here. This is because var dump automatically echoes out whatever you pass to it. Let's change this true to false. And of course, we will see the update as expected. Now let's do something a bit different and add an exclamation to the front. This reverses the polarity of this variable, essentially making false true and true false. This can be useful when you want to return the opposite value of what is passed to it. You can also pass an expression to a variable. So let's update this from false to numPosts and title. Using a double ampersand is the equivalent of the AND operand, which means if both sides of the operand are true, it will return true. And remembering what we learned before, if these data types are different, such as string or integer, they're automatically cast as Booleans when this expression is evaluated. When one of these values is false, then of course the entire statement is false, since both expressions must be true to return a truthy result. Similarly, we can pass in a double pipe instead of the ampersand, which stands for or. So if either one or the other of these values is true, the entire expression is true. We can also negate the entire expression by wrapping it in parentheses and then negating the expression. This will first execute the numPost or title expression, which would be true, and then it negates it, which makes the entire expression false. For now, let's set hasPost equal to numPost is greater than 0. Note how I also left spaces between the comparison operator just to make things much easier to read. So this means that whenever we have post greater than 0, the evaluation is true. Conditionally execute PHP code with an if statement. Every programming language has the concept of conditional statements. If this, then that. PHP is definitely not any different. To write a condition will of course need to be within a PHP tag. We can write everything within one code block just like this, or use 2 or more inline PHP statements. But for now, we'll just use this block method. It is more common to write code like this in PHP programs. Let's type if, and afterwards comes an open and close parentheses. Within these parentheses is a condition. We can write a condition inline just like this. And this is usually how most developers write if statements. Note how we already have this hasPosts variable, though, already assigned to the result of the same condition. If we didn't already have this within a variable, it would be a good idea to write our condition and store the result within one. So let's take the hasPost variable and replace our condition with it. Not only does this make our code easier to read, but it also makes our code read more like human language. If has posts is a lot easier to understand than if num post is greater than 0. The variable name also provides meaning to this condition. It's self-documenting the code along the way, which helps us avoid bugs in the future. Next comes an open and closed bracket. Within this bracket is where we will execute our code if the condition is true. In this case, let's just echo out posts exist. This is currently a valid if statement. If we save and refresh the page, we will see that posts exist message. Write multiple conditions to execute alternate PHP code. We can also supply an else condition, which will execute an alternate block of code whenever the checked condition is false. We can do this by adding else after our closing bracket with another open and closed bracket. And within here, let's echo out, there are no posts. And to trigger this condition, has post must be false. So let's change number of post to 0. And when we save and refresh this page, we will see our there are no posts message. We can also use else if we had multiple conditions to check. Say, for example, we wanted to execute a bit of code, but only if the number of posts is exactly 3. We can go ahead and add another else statement with an open and close bracket, but change this to else if. And we can pass in the condition for this else if to match. Let's say num posts equal 3. And then let's echo out, there are exactly 3 posts. Now, if we update number of posts to 3 and save and refresh the page, we will see we still get this posts exist message. This is because PHP evaluates code from top down. This means that the first condition which matches a truthy result will be returned. And since has post is true, this echo statement will output first and then bypass the remaining statements. In order for our code to execute as we would expect, this number of posts equal 3 check would need to come before has posts. So let's switch around these conditions by moving the conditions around. And we will also change the echo statements so they appear in their appropriate places. Now, if we save and refresh, we will see our there are exactly 3 posts message. And if we set num posts back to 10 and refresh, we will see that it correctly falls back to this second condition. Before we move on, a quick note about this double equal sign. This is a comparison operator, but this is considered a weak check. This is because if num posts actually equals a string, let's say a string of 3, this will still evaluate to true. A double equal sign will only check the result of these values and not the actual data types of the values. In order to enforce a strict check of not only the values but also the data types, we will use a triple equal sign. This will check not only the value of each side of this equation, but also make sure the data types match. If we save and refresh the page here, we will see that this condition evaluates to false since 3 is not an integer. If we change this to an integer, this will return true. A triple equal sign is definitely the preferred method in PHP for comparing two values, and you should really never use a double equal sign unless you had a very specific reason to do so, and it's probably not a good one. Alternate PHP if statement syntax for view files. We can also write these if-else statements using an alternate syntax. Currently, this is written in one giant block of PHP code, but usually when you are intermingling PHP and HTML, you will instead want to use inline PHP blocks with an alternate if-else syntax. Let's remove all of this code and we will use inline PHP instead. Within this tag, we will have our if statement followed by the condition of checking if has post is true. But rather than using a bracket, we will use a colon To end this control structure, we will open up another PHP tag, and within it, we will type end if. Since we are closing up this PHP tag directly after it, we do not need a semicolon here. And since our PHP tags are closed off, we don't need an echo statement or anything within this if statement. We can just type our posts exist message. Since this is outside the normal scope of PHP statements, the HTML will just be outputted. And when we save and refresh the page, we will see that our code still executes properly. The else statement works in very much the same way. By opening up another PHP tag, we can type else followed by a semicolon. And then we can execute any fallback code within this block. So this will be where our there are no posts message goes. And if we update num post to 0 and refresh the page, we can see that this else condition still executes. This alternate syntax is not used within larger blocks of PHP because it is hard to know when conditional statements start or stop when they don't have brackets, especially because you can nest multiple if statements together. Let's bring back our there are exactly 3 posts message, and we can add this check within the has posts conditional logic. Rather than directly outputting posts exist, let's replace this with another PHP tag. We will add another if statement, and this will check if num posts equals 3. And if so, we will output there are exactly 3 posts. And if not, we can run an else statement and then output our posts exist message. And then we can close up this if statement with end if. Now, if our number of posts has 3 and we refresh the page, our there are exactly 3 post message shows because has post is true and number of posts equals 3. And if this is 10 or some other figure besides 3 and greater than 0, when we refresh the page, this post exists message will get caught because num post does not equal 3. Note that this has the exact same output as the previous lesson that used an else if statement, though this uses completely different logic to carry this out. This proves that there is almost always more than one way to do something, and there are usually different approaches that can be used to tackle the same task. Refactor a PHP if-else statement into a ternary. Because checking for a truthy result is so common, PHP supplies a simplified if-else shorthand syntax called a ternary. This is useful when you want to execute a very simple statement based on the result of a condition. Rather than using if-else here, we will use a question mark and a colon. We're going to first remove this num posts logic of exactly 3 posts since we won't be dealing with it anymore. And we will refactor this if has post condition to a ternary. Let's go ahead and remove this, and we will create a new PHP tag. And in this logic, since we are just echoing out 2 lines, we can write our echo tag first, followed by the condition. Our condition is has posts, and you can think of this as the part in between the parentheses of an if statement. We can even add parentheses around it if we wish, but that's not really necessary at the moment. Next comes a question mark, which is the equivalent of open and close brackets of an if statement. And then since we are echoing something out, next will be the value that we want returned to this echo statement when this condition is true. This will be posts exist. Immediately after this string is the else condition, which is represented with a colon. This follows the same format as the question mark, so the result of executing this else condition will come next. And this will output there are no posts. And let me expand this window just a little bit so we can actually see what's going on within our code. So you'll notice we'll also need an ending PHP tag. So if has post is true, we'll echo out posts exist. If not, it will echo out there are no posts. And if we save and refresh this page, we can see that post exist still shows if it's 10. And if this is 0, we will get the output of there are no posts. The vigilant watchers of this lesson may have noticed that this PHP tag is followed with an echo statement. And you'll notice that this can be refactored into a short echo statement. This can give us the highest level of terseness, or the most concise code possible for this block of code. I greatly prefer ternaries when they are used in this format with short echo tags and with conditions that are assigned to well-named variables. They are just so simple and easy to read once you get used to this format. Just keep in mind that you only really ever want to use a ternary when you're dealing with Boolean logic that is mainly just a single true or false condition. This is why I assign conditional logic to variables such as has posts, because it makes your code so much easier to read. I also use this method a lot in backend PHP code when evaluating and returning values from Boolean checks. But whenever conditions get more complex or seem hard to follow along with ternaries, you'll want to use the longer if-else format, as it will be easier to understand for more complex conditional statements. Use a PHP switch statement for advanced conditional logic. Right now, we are using a ternary to check if we have post and displaying an appropriate message. But what if we wanted to do something a bit more complex? Ternaries are only really good for simple Booleans like this or that logic, but not this, then, and then something else logic. If statements are okay for these situations, but they can also lead to some repeated code throughout your logic. Since we want to add some additional functionality to the display of this message, in this situation, it's better to use a switch statement. With a switch, you supply a condition and then define any number of cases the condition may match. Let's go ahead and create a switch statement under this numPost display variable. And this will just be switch. And just like an if statement, we will supply a condition within parentheses, which will just be numPosts. Then we will have an open and close bracket, just like if statements. The following format is where things start to differ. Next comes a case keyword, followed by the result we wish to match to this condition of numPosts. Since this will be an integer, the matching result will be a number. For example, if we wanted to target 0 post, we will write out case 0. And then next comes a colon. And now everything after this colon is considered a separate logic block, and all code continues to execute until it encounters a break keyword. So let's create a new message variable, and we will set it equal to there are no posts. And since we don't want the logic in this block to continue, we will add a break statement. For any other condition matches, we will just repeat this process. So let's set up our case 3 to match our logic for only matching 3 posts. And for this match, we will set message equal to there are a few posts. And then we will type our break keyword. One neat thing we can also do with a case statement is that if we wanted this message to also display for a result matching not only 3, but also 1 and 2, we can define multiple case statements to match it with. So we can type case 1 and also case 2, and they will all fall back to this same message variable. Since PHP doesn't encounter a break keyword on these other case statements, it will continue processing all of these matching conditions as a single block to execute. And finally, we can also supply a default fallback to handle the event when any of these case statements do not match a condition. This will just be the default keyword followed by a colon. Since this will only execute when numPost is greater than or equal to 4, we will just set this message equal to there are many posts. We do not need a break keyword here since this is the end of the switch statement. And finally, let's update the display to display this message variable down here rather than our ternary. Let's replace this with a p tag, and we will just use a short echo tag to output the message variable. And let's go ahead and save and test out this logic. For number of posts equal to 10, this will say there are many posts. When it is 3, this will say there are few posts. And when it's 0, it will say there are no posts. Note that conditions on switch statements are loose type checks, meaning that it will also match strings of the same value. So if we change this 0 to a quoted out string and refresh the page, it will still match that 0 string. Use a match statement for advanced data checks. A new feature introduced in PHP 8 is the match statement, which is an alternative to the switch statement. Some complaints about switch statements have been that it's a bit too verbose. You can forget to include one of these break keywords and your logic will get messed up, and that the conditional check is loose rather than strict. The match statement aims to solve all of these issues. Let's rewrite this entire switch statement into a match statement. Our first change will be that we will assign the match statement to a variable instead, and that will be this message variable. This implies right away that a value is returned from match. And let's go ahead and set it equal to match. And the condition will be still number of posts. Next comes the values that we wish to match. We'll type 0 here for matching 0 posts, and then assign this the value of there are no posts. Note how we are assigning variables here. It's an equal sign followed by a greater than sign. This is how key value assignments are made in PHP. The key is the 0 and the value is this there are no posts string. Since this is a variable assignment, we also need to make sure to end the match statement with a semicolon. With key value assignments, it's common to add more assignments in later, so it's a good idea also to end every single one of these lines with a comma. If you use version control, making updates to these key value assignments will lead to cleaner diffs in your code. Let's create another possible match, and this time for 1. But let's add on a 2 and 3 as well. This is a huge spot where match differs from switch. Rather than typing case every time, we could just type out the numbers delimited with commas. And then we can return there are some posts. You may have noticed something else here as well. There are no break statements with match. As soon as a condition is matched, it returns the value and exits out of the match statement. This can lead to code that is a bit easier to understand, and you never need to worry about forgetting the break keyword. And finally, just like switch, we can define a default fallback. And for this value, we can just return there are many posts. And just like that, we have the same logic as our switch case statement. And if we test this out, we will see that this is true. In addition, note that this is a strict data check, which means that if we pass a string, it will not catch the resulting matches with a different data type. For example, if we pass in a 3 and save and refresh, we will get our there are some posts message. But if we pass in a string of 3, we will get there are many posts because it will fall back to this default condition. Create a list using a PHP array. Sometimes you need to store a list of data. In this example of a blog, this may be a collection of tags to categorize the content of our posts. First, let's remove this match statement since we will no longer be using this logic. Next, let's create a new variable named tags. And this tags variable will be equal to a left and right bracket. Within this bracket, we can define any number of items separated with commas. We can store a list of years, for example, 1999, 2000, 2001, or we can store a list of strings. This is what we will do for our tags. If we are creating a blog about programming, this may be something like PHP, Docker, MySQL. We can store any number of tags in this array, and it can be as long as we wish. This is similar to creating 3 separate variables, but instead of doing that, this is a lot more concise and allows us to store multiple units of data within a single variable. Display the contents of an array with a for each loop. Arrays aren't too useful by themselves, so they're usually used in combination with a loop, also known as an iterator. These loops iterate through every value within an array so you can do something with it. The most common type of loop statement in PHP is a for each statement. This iterates through all records of an array, no matter how many there are. Let's open up a new PHP tag at the end of this file. For each statements follow a similar format to if statements, with a for each keyword followed by an open and closed parentheses, and then an open and closed bracket. Within the parentheses comes the variable that we'd like to iterate over. So this will be tags. Next comes an as keyword, and then any arbitrary variable name for the iteration. We'll name this tag. Within the curly brackets will be the code that we want to execute within each iteration of the loop. This for each loop will loop through every single one of the values within this tags array. So the first iteration will be PHP, the next will be Docker and MySQL, and each one of those iterations will be assigned to the tag variable name. And within this for each loop, we will be within the context of the iteration. Let's just use an echo tag within this loop, and we will echo out the tag. And let's go ahead and save this and see how this looks. And we'll see all of these words squished together, and it looks like one word. This is because there are no line breaks echoed out within our code, and this is just outputted in an HTML file. So let's go ahead and concatenate on a BR tag to add a line break of HTML. And when we refresh this page, we will now see that each of these tags is outputted on its own line. Use an array key to determine current iteration. Creating our list of tags, we only define the values of the tags. Even though we did not explicitly define them, keys also exist within arrays. If we don't define them, keys are created for us automatically, and they are zero-based, which means they start at 0. So the first value of this loop is PHP, and its key is 0. The second one has a key of 1, and the third one has a key of 2. So the key of a value is always 1 less than the number of the value within the array. We can access the key within a for each loop by passing it in as a first value right after this as. This can be any arbitrary variable name again, but it's common to use the name key. Then before this tag variable is defined, we will place an equal sign and a greater sign operator. This is an assignment operator that is commonly used with arrays. And then let's go ahead and move to our echo tag, and we will output this key followed by a colon. When we save and refresh the page, we will see evidence of this zero-based array. It's easy to remember this format as for each array as key equals value. And $value is often used as the iterator value within loops. Create a key value store within a PHP array. It's time to finally start building out our post into an array. When prototyping an app, it's common to hard code elements so you can just get things moving without relying on a database connection. And we will do this just with our posts. First, we will remove our tags variable, as this will later be derived from our post data. We can also remove the has post variable since we are not currently using it. And let's create a new post variable, and we'll assign it to an empty array. For now, this will just contain the info for a single blog post. We'll keep things simple and just have 2 properties for our blog post, title and content, and we'll store each one within its own key value assignment. Let's set a new title index, and we will again use the equal greater sign symbol just like we used in the for each statement. And then we will define the value of this index, which will just be how to learn PHP. And then we will type a comma and then define our second index content. This will be our main blog content. For now, we will just set this equal to this is how you learn PHP. Rather than using a for each loop, we can also directly display the contents from an array using what's called bracket notation. Rather than using this for each statement, let's go ahead and just remove this, and we will replace it with an h3 tag. And within here, let's just echo out the post variable. But after post, we will tack on a left and right bracket. And then we can call the title as a string. Calling an array just like this refers to the value for title, which would be how to learn PHP. And we can do the same thing for content, and we will just output this within a p tag. Now, when saving this file and refreshing, we will see both the title outputted as well as the content. Create a nested or multi-dimensional array in PHP. This setup works for one post, but we are building a blog and obviously need to support multiple posts. What's cool about PHP arrays is that you can have arrays within arrays. Above our post variable, let's go ahead and create a posts variable, and we will set it equal to an empty array. Just like how we put the title and content each on their own lines in this post array, let's open up this bracket within posts. Then what we can do is take the contents of this post and paste it in as the first value to this posts variable. And then we can just remove this post variable. We can see that we now have an array, then an array within that array. This will allow us to store multiple posts within a single array, and it's called a multi-dimensional array. Let's go ahead and copy this first blog post and make another one. And we will change this how to learn PHP text to how to learn MySQL. And we will update the related text in the content. You also need to make sure there are trailing commas within each value of this posts array. Let's go ahead and scroll down to the output, and we will replace this h3 and p tag with a single pre tag. This outputs all of the text within it in a pre-formatted or mono-spaced font. This is really useful whenever you want to directly output specific data from a PHP tag. And then within it, we will create a new PHP tag, and this will call the var dump function. And the value we will pass this function is the posts array. Note how we aren't using a short PHP echo tag here. We're using a full PHP tag. This is because var dump automatically executes out any data that is passed to it. Now when we save and refresh the page, we will see the full output of this array. We will see that the main array has a contents of 2 items, and that the first item has a key of 0, and the second item has a key of 1. Each of these array values is also assigned to another array, each containing 2 values. This includes the title and content keys. Get the count of a PHP array. There are many functions available relating to PHP arrays, and it's time to replace our number of post variable with a dynamic value that uses our new posts array. This is an easy one. We will just replace this hard-coded 10 with a call to the count function, passing in the value of posts. When we save and refresh our page, we will see that the value dynamically updated to the count of our posts array. We'll also notice that if we remove one of these array elements from the post variable and save and update the page, this one value is correct, but it says posts instead of one post. So let's replace the contents of this numPost display variable with a dynamic value. First, we will create a new variable that contains our post text. Let's call this post text, and we will set it equal to a ternary. You can think of ternaries as a shorthand if-else statement that's a lot more elegant and easier to read. This will be a condition which starts off with num posts equal and only equal 1, followed by a question mark, and then what to return if this value is true. So if there is one post, we want to return post, and this will follow with a colon, which means otherwise, we will return posts. So again, if num posts equals 1, we will return post, otherwise we will return posts. And then we will update this num post display contents to equal num posts, a space, and then post text. Now when we go ahead and save this page and refresh, it will say 1 post. And if we go ahead and add in that index for MySQL and save the page and refresh, it will say 2 posts. You can use ternaries whenever your if-else condition isn't too complex and you are usually just wanting to output data based on a single truthy or false result. Be sure to check out the many available built-in functions available for PHP arrays, as these really start to make arrays much more powerful than any other regular variables. Display the contents of an array with a for loop. We've previously used a foreach loop to display the contents of an array, but we can also use a for loop. This has a bit of a weird syntax and is a bit more complex than foreach, but gives you some extra flexibility, including a built-in counter and the ability to exit out of a loop based on that counter value or another condition. Let's go ahead and replace this call to var dump with a new PHP block. We'll start our new for loop and then open up a parentheses. For loops accept 3 parameters, a counter, a condition, and an incrementer. Our counter will be a regular PHP variable. For some reason, it's common practice to use an I variable for counters, probably just because it's easier to type, and perhaps it stands for increment or index. We'll start this with a value set equal to 0. This is to account for arrays being 0-based indexes, meaning that the first key of an array always starts with 0. Our parameters will be separated with semicolons. The next parameter is a condition. We will set this equal to I is less than num posts. So this will execute for however many posts we have and then no more. Finally, we need to iterate this counter, so we will set this iterator equal to I++. This will add a value to the I variable on every iteration. Now we can go ahead and use curly brackets just like for each loops. But one thing I didn't previously mention when we talked about for each loops is that we also have access to an alternate syntax. Just like if and end if, we can use an alternate syntax with colons, and we can actually end a for each loop with end for each. Similarly, we can replace this bracket with a colon and end this statement with end for. This syntax is a bit easier to read within template files whenever you are outputting data. And it's very common to use single line PHP statements with this syntax. So let's go ahead and migrate this over. Within this loop, we can now output variables from our posts array. Let's go ahead and create an h3 tag. And within it, we will use a short echo tag to output the value of posts. And remember that we can always reference arrays directly by their index. And we can reference this first value of the post array with a bracket $i variable. This will initially be set equal to 0, which is the first record of our array. We can also tack on a second set of brackets afterwards. And this is how we can access properties of this array. So we can just reference the string of title to grab the title of this first index array. We can do the same thing for content but this will be with a P tag. And when we save and refresh this page, we will see each record of this post array being outputted. Continue or break out of a PHP loop. It's possible to either skip over the current iteration of a loop or break out of it. To skip over the current iteration, you can use a continue keyword within a conditional. Let's add another record onto this array, this time for how to learn Nginx. And when we save and refresh the page, we will see that there are now 3 posts, and the last one being how to learn Nginx. But let's say we wanted to skip over blog post titles that contain the text SQL. We can do this by writing an if statement within the foreach loop and then continuing with the loop. So let's create a new PHP tag, and we will write an if statement. For the condition, we can check if a specific variable contains a string of text by calling the str_contains function. This function accepts 2 arguments. The first argument is the variable we'd like to check text against. So this will be the current iteration of the loop, which is posts bracket $i, and then we are checking against the title key. The second argument is the text we'd like to search for, which would be SQL. And finally, we will close up this if statement with an end if. So this condition will return true if the title contains the text SQL. So if this matches, let's call the continue keyword. This will skip over the current iteration of the loop, not outputting the lines that follow it. So if we save and refresh the page, we will see that how to learn MySQL post is completely skipped over, but the Nginx post is still outputted. Similarly, we can use the break keyword to completely break out of a loop. So if we change continue to break and refresh the page, you will see that break completely exits out of the loop and only outputs the first iteration. This is useful if you wanted to prevent the loop from further executing based on a certain condition. Purpose of a function in PHP. Sometimes code can get a bit unwieldy. You can tell that our simple little PHP script is starting to get more and more complex. This is a simple example, but what happens when we continue to add more and more code? You guessed it, it starts to become harder to update code because it takes longer to find that specific area of code that you want to reference, and updates start to become more error prone. Since everything resides in a single file, one little mistake can take down our entire app. The first step, progressing into a more complex but organized code and file system and structure, is to start combining related code together, and you can do this with a function. A function just encapsulates a little piece of code. Functions are meant to be extremely small and only carry out one single specific task. There is a design pattern known as the Single Responsibility Principle, or SRP. The idea behind this is that every piece of a program, such as a class, module, or function, should have a single purpose. This keeps blocks of code short and concise and leads to easier debugging. When starting out, you don't need to obsess over the single responsibility principle, but if you generally follow this concept, your code will be more performant, easier to reason about, and simpler to update. This drastically slims down single files of PHP and naturally organizes your code in a more efficient manner. Create a function in PHP. To create a function, you need to first decide which piece of code belongs in it. Something that takes up a large portion of this file is this posts array. Let's encapsulate this chunk of code by moving it to its own function. We'll start by creating a new function at the top of the file with the function keyword. It's good practice to put all functions at or near the top of files. Next comes the name of the function. One of the hardest things in programming, especially with creating functions, is figuring out how to name it. Regular functions have a name that is specific to the task it carries out. Since we want to essentially return a list of posts in this first function, Let's call this get posts. It's common to use camel case when naming functions, which is the first word lowercase and the first letter of every subsequent word capitalized. You can name functions just about however you wish as long as it doesn't start with a number or odd character, but common convention and practice is to use standard camel case names. If you're wondering what to name your function, you can also name it with an action object. So the action here is get, and the object is posts. Next comes an open and close parentheses, and then an open and close curly bracket. These brackets segment out the code of this function, so everything within these brackets belongs to it. It's also recommended to place a line break after the closing parentheses and before this first curly bracket, just so you can easily tell where the function starts and ends. Function and global scope in PHP. Now that we have our function created, let's grab this entire posts array and go ahead and move it into the getPost function. If we scroll down, we'll see immediately that our post variable is returning undefined. This is due to something called scope. There are different scopes in PHP, and the function completely encapsulates the code within the brackets. This means that the posts variable within the getPost function is inaccessible to code outside of the function. Similarly, if we grab this title variable and place it above the function and then try to reference it within this function, we will see that it is also returned as undefined. So we now know that functions cannot access variables outside of the function, and code outside of a function cannot access variables in a function. This is what scope is. It's a barrier so that code can't get in or leak out of encapsulated code. You might think this is absolutely horrible, but actually the opposite is true. Since nothing can get in or out, our encapsulated code provides us with deterministic reliability. This means that when we call our function, we know we will get a consistent result even if external variables change. If we didn't have the concept of scope, we would be unable to write programs that were reliable. Note that we do have access to the global scope within our function, which means that we can call any of the built-in PHP functions within our functions. However, code within our functions cannot be directly called from outside of the function. Calling functions with return values in PHP. Since the post variable returns undefined here, if we try to execute this code, we will get an undefined variable error, which is the same error that PHP Storm is giving us. So our next step is to actually call the code of this getPost function and assign it to a value of this post variable. Let's go ahead and create a new posts variable, and we will set it equal to our function name, which is getPosts. We will execute the function by calling it with a set of open and close parentheses. Now, when we save and re-execute this code, we will actually get another error. This is a fatal PHP error, and if we read it through, it says argument 1, which is $value, must be of type countable or array, null given. It also gives us exactly where this error is occurring, which is the index.php file on line 22. So if we go ahead and check line 22, that will be when we call the count function. Since the error is saying the argument type is null, that is essentially telling us that the post variable is null. Well, how can that be? Well, we created the function and it executed the code within it, but since we cannot access the code of the function outside of it, a null response is actually returned, which means nothing is returned. In order to get access to the result of the function call, the function must return some sort of value, and we can do this with the return keyword. After this post variable within our function, let's go ahead and type return. And following return will be the data we want to return. This will be the posts variable, which is equal to this array of data. Now, if we save and re-execute the code, we will see that we get our desired result. We're only getting one element of the array because we still have this breakcode within our for loop. So let's go ahead and remove that, save and refresh, and we will see we are getting all elements of our array. Looking back at our function, you can see that we are assigning a value to a variable and then returning that variable. This is a common pattern, so there is a shorthand for doing this. You can leave it just like this if you prefer for the increased readability, but if you return a value that is then immediately assigned, it's more common to just return that value. So instead of returning posts, we can remove this. We can remove the definition of our post variable and just return the array. And if we refresh, we will see that we get the same result. If you are using an IDE like PHP Storm, you can also start to collapse blocks of code, such as code within functions, by clicking on the minus sign next to the function. To expand it back out, you can click the plus sign next to the function or click on the ellipses containing your code. But collapsing blocks of code can make your files a bit easier to understand. Passing arguments to PHP functions. We just learned how to get the resulting value executed from a function, but we didn't yet learn how to pass data to a function. Since functions do not have access to outside scope, the idea of an argument was created in order for us to be able to pass data into a function. Arguments are passed to functions within parentheses, similar to how this count function executes and passes in the posts variable. Let's create another function, this time for the post text. We will again use the function keyword, and we will name this function getPostText. Within this function, let's go ahead and copy the contents from this post text variable into the function, and then we will return it. You'll notice that this numPost variable is underlined within a squiggly, and it says it is undefined. We can move this numPost and post variable into this function, but this breaks the single responsibility principle, and our function is doing way too much. Remember that functions should only do one thing and one thing only. So let's go ahead and back this out. And instead, we will pass this numPost as an argument to this function. So within the open and close parentheses, we will go ahead and define our numPosts variable. And you'll immediately see that this red squiggly goes away. So everything is valid now, and the value of numPost is satisfied by this variable that we are passing in as an argument. Now, since this expression is executed and a value is returned when we call getPostText, let's go ahead and replace the same text with a call to getPostText. And then we will pass in numPosts as an argument to the function. So just like count, we are calling the function and then passing in our argument to the function. When we save and go ahead and refresh the page, we will see that the code still executes exactly the same, as the variables are now properly passing into these functions, and the results of the functions are properly returned to these same variables. Defining function, return, and argument types in PHP. In order to make sure our code consistently returns the type of data that we expect it to return, we can make sure the data is casted to a specific data type by specifying it as a return type. Let's define a return type for the getPosts function, which is the expected return value of a function. If we look at getPost, we can easily see that we are returning an array of data. To make sure this function always returns an array, no matter what, we can specify that as a return type after the parentheses. We can do this by specifying a colon and then the data type of the return value that we want to enforce it to. So this will be an array. If we then look at get post text, we can see that our final result is returning a string. Similarly, let's define a return type here with a colon, and then followed by the return type that we wish, which here is string. You will want to specify function return types in every function you write to make sure that the function is always returning the data that you expect it to return. This helps enforce the integrity of your code base so that when you call a function, you can always expect it to return the same data type. For example, you would never want this getPostText function to return an array or some sort of other value, as that would break any code that is calling and displaying the output of this function call. Just like return types, you can also cast arguments to specific types. This should also be done throughout your entire code base. By defining an argument as a specific type, PHP will ensure this value is casted to this type, which will make your code more reliable. We can do this by specifying the type we want arguments to cast to before the name of the argument variable. For example, if we want numPost to always be an integer, we can define that as an int and followed by a space right before that variable definition. Type coercion and strict data types in PHP. Now that we have data types for return values and arguments set up, every time data is returned from a function or passed to it, it will be casted or converted into that data type. For example, if we call getPostText with the value of 1.0, which is a type of float rather than int, and save and refresh the page, we will see that everything still works. The value of 3 posts changed to 3 post, but it still executes. This is because the value of numPost is casted to an integer when it's passed into this function. We can confirm this by calling the var underscore dump function and outputting 1.0, and we will do the same within the function var dump, and then we will output numPost to see how this value changes. Now when we save and refresh the page, we will see the first var dump that executes is a float, and the second time var dump is called, it's outputted as an int. This conversion process that takes place is something called type coercion. You can also see that the code executes successfully, even though we passed in code that contained a data type that was different from the type our function argument expected it to be. Type coercion seems like some sort of magical helper, but in actuality, it can actually lead to a bunch of nasty errors down the line. This is because PHP is auto-magically converting data values to other data types in the background, and that is probably not desired when you want to write code that, when given the same input, consistently returns the same output. You can essentially turn off this type coercion by enabling something called strict types. At the top of our file, right after the open PHP tag, let's call the declare construct. This declare keyword lets you set specific PHP directives for a block of code or file that is being executed. We can toggle on the strict types directive by passing in a strict underscore types value and set it equal to 1. Now when we save and refresh the page, we will see that the function doesn't even execute, but a fatal error is thrown. If you want to write reliable code, this is exactly what you want to happen. You'll see that you get a very specific error that says argument number 1, numPost, must be of type int float given. This is a great error because it tells you exactly what is going on. We can also see exactly where this error occurs in the next couple lines. Let's check out line 31 and 21. 31 is the code that we are calling the function with, and 21 is the argument that is being passed into this getPostText function. So this first line of line 31 tells us what piece of code is initiating the error. And the second line defined after it tells us exactly what rule is causing that error to occur. And if we check out this line 31, we will also see that PHP Storm is flagging a specific error right in the editor. And this is the same error, expected parameter of type int, float provided. It's very explicit. This is another great reason to use an IDE such as PHP Storm, because it will notify you of errors that occur before you even execute the program. Let's go ahead and remove these var dump calls and go ahead and replace our call to this get post text function back with the num posts variable. Now when we save and refresh the page, we can see that no fatal errors occur because we're passing the value into the function with the desired argument type. Including or requiring files in PHP. Up until now, all of our code has been written in a single PHP file, but obviously as your app grows, this won't work, and you'll probably need to organize your code into multiple files. Specifically, these functions really take up a lot of space. We can collapse them, but it's much better to organize them into their own file. Within our project, let's go ahead and create a new PHP file named functions.php. This file will be created in the root of our app right next to the index.php file. And let's go to our index.php and copy the top contents of this file over to functions.php. I like to space out my functions with line breaks and properly indent all of my code with 4 spaces. This makes code easier to see and reason about when you are looking through it. White space is removed by the PHP processor, so you can add as many line breaks and indents as you wish. Let's go ahead and save this file, and then we will return back to our index.php file. And we can go ahead and remove the code that contains our functions. We will leave the declare strict types line at the top of this file because I think keeping that line at the top of every PHP file in our app leads to more reliable applications. Now, if we save and refresh our page, we can see that we get an error that says call to undefined function get posts on line 4. We actually have multiple errors occurring in this file, but PHP only outputs the first error that occurs and then halts the remaining execution of the script. You probably figured out that this getPost function is not found because there is no reference to the functions.php file that we created that contains the getPost function, along with the getPost text function. There are 2 ways to include a file in PHP, and they're both language constructs. One construct is named include, and the other is named require. You can call these constructs just like regular built-in PHP functions. The difference between the two is that require requires the file to exist and include doesn't. So for example, at the top of our file, if we write include and then pass in my fancy file.php, and if we save and refresh the page, notice that PHP outputs a warning, but it still continues the execution of the script as our call to undefined function getPost error still occurs. But if we change this include line to require and save and refresh the page, that call to undefined function error never occurs because further execution of the program is stopped. This means that include allows you to include optional files that may or may not exist, but require has a hard requirement on that file existing. There are use cases for each, but when in doubt, always use require as it will make your code more consistent and reliable in the long run. And let's go ahead and change my fancy file to functions.php. This is the new file that we created that contains our 2 functions, getPosts and get post text. So when we actually call these functions in our code, it will find them and execute it properly. And when we reload, we will see we are back to our properly working app. The result of writing this code is essentially the same effect as having functions written out directly within our index.php file, but allows us to better organize and structure our code. Create and instantiate a class in PHP. A great way to structure your code once it gets more and more complex is to use PHP classes. Classes allow you to organize and co-locate multiple functions of business logic together into a unified entity. Let's go ahead and create a new folder for our classes, and we will name this directory classes. And then within it, we will create a new file named author.php and make sure the author has a capital A. It's best practice to name all of the file names for classes with a capital letter. Next, let's go ahead and open a PHP tag and we will declare strict types. And next, we will use the class keyword followed by the name of our class, which is author. And then what follows is an open and closed curly bracket. So this is a class. Nothing else is going on within it, but it is a full class that represents an author entity. Now we will include this class in our functions.php file. So after this declare strict types tag at the beginning of our file, let's go ahead and add a require statement. And we will be requiring this file in classes/author.php. PHP instantiation happens with a special keyword called new. When we follow new with the class name we'd like to create, followed by parentheses, when PHP parses the code, it will create a new object that is an instance of this new class that we created. So within get posts, let's go ahead and create a new author variable, and we will set it equal to new author, which is our class name. At the moment, this code is just creating a new instance of this author object and assigning it to the author variable. So this variable now holds a reference to this newly created object. Run code on PHP class creation with a constructor. We can execute a bit of code that runs at the time objects are being created with a special piece of functionality called a constructor. Constructors are a built-in PHP feature at the language level and use what's known as a magic method, which are always prefixed with 2 underscores. Let's create a constructor within our author class by creating a new public function named __construct. And within this function, we will just output a string just to let us know that this constructor was executed. So let's call var dump and we will pass in author class instantiated. Now when we save and refresh our page, we will see that string being outputted, so we know this constructor is executing. This magic method will execute or run every time a new instance of a class is created with the new keyword. Related to that, functions within classes are also referred to as class methods, not functions. But you may hear the terms methods and functions used interchangeably. They are generally the same thing. We can also pass values into constructors. So I'm going to pass my name, Mark Schust, into this class object within the parentheses as a string. So let's pass Mark Schust. And now we will create a method argument to assign to the string, which can be any arbitrary value. If you are using PHP Storm, you can also command or alt click into the class to go directly to it. And let's assign this string the value of $name. And rather than dumping out this author class instantiated string, we will just output the name variable. And when we refresh our page,
we can see that the argument is being passed into this constructor and being outputted. We can use this approach anytime we wanted to create an object with a specific value or property and then do something to it later on in our code. Create class properties in previous versions of PHP. We now have a value passed to the constructor, but a var dump really won't be doing anything for us. We need to assign this value to a variable. In classes, you do this with something called a class property. You can think of classes as representing a specific entity and properties representing values related to that entity. Just like in this example, the author is the entity and the author name would be a good property. We can also have other properties like gender, age, location, and so on. This lesson covers class properties in versions of PHP that came before PHP 8. I included it first though because it will help you understand how scope and properties work within classes, or if you needed to work with legacy code that was created in versions before PHP 8. You can create a class property by using a scope keyword right at the start of a class. We will get into scopes in a bit more detail later on, but for now, let's just create a new property with the public scope. This is the default scope for functions and properties. Next comes the name of the property, and this will be a variable name. So let's just name this $name. And you can also define a data type for this class property, which would go in between the scope and the name of the property. This is a string, so we can cast this as the string data type. Next, we will update our constructor to assign it to this property. So within our constructor, we will first use the $this keyword. The $this keyword references the class that you are currently within. So this is the specific instance of this author class, which is actually the author variable. Next, we will use a dash and greater than sign, which is referred to as an arrow. And next comes the property name, which in this case is name. This is derived from the name of our property without the $. And finally, we can just set this value equal to our argument name, which is $name, which comes from our argument. You can define as many properties as you like here by duplicating out the lines and then changing the names and value types of each property. And you can also pass in multiple arguments and assign them to those property names if you wish, depending on your needs. Create promoted properties in PHP 8 classes. Since this convention of creating a class property up here, passing in an argument name, and then assigning that argument to the property is so common in code, PHP 8 introduced a shorthand for this process. The shorthand is a new feature of PHP 8 called promoted properties or constructor property promotion, and it greatly simplifies your code. It also eliminates a lot of the repetition happening with the naming of these properties and values. You'll notice that this name is referenced 4 times throughout our code. Constructor property promotion replaces this with a single reference. Rather than defining the scope and casting of the class property at the top of the class, we will move it to directly within our related argument. So rather than having public string up here, let's go ahead and move it to before our argument name. And by doing this, we can eliminate this class property definition at the top of the file. You will also notice that PHP Storm grayed out this name assignment within the constructor. This is because PHP 8 has already assigned it to the class property by defining the scope within our argument definition. So we can remove this dead code. By simply defining the method argument with a scope, it assigns it to a class property with the same name. This eliminates all of the duplication of the class property name within our code. Because there can be many arguments defined within a constructor, it's common practice to break each of these method arguments onto their own line. This makes code much more readable and easier to understand. It's also a good idea to move the closing parentheses and brackets all to their own line. This will save a lot of space with line breaks, especially since this method body is now empty. So this code is the exact equivalent of the previous this assignment of class properties in the previous lesson. Retrieve public class properties with PHP's arrow syntax. We already created a constructor in this author class, which executes when a class is created or instantiated. Since this name class property has a public visibility, we can refer to it directly with a special arrow syntax on the created object instance. Let's go back to our functions.php file, and we will name this variable author1, and we will actually create a second instance of the author object, and let's name this Betsy Sue. We can now assign properties of these created objects to new author indexes on the posts array. So let's go to this first array element, and we will create a new author index, and this will be assigned a value of author1 arrow name. We can reference this name class property directly since it is public in scope. And let's do the same thing for this second blog article. In the third one, we will reference author2's name. Now we want to display the author on our blog post listing page. So let's go back to the index.php file and let's create a new line for the byline. And we will refer to the author index that we just created. Now when we refresh the page, we will see that it grabs the instance of the name class property from both the newly created PHP objects. Understanding scope in PHP classes. So far, we've just dealt with the public scope on both class methods and class properties, which is the default scope visibility in PHP. However, two other scope visibilities exist, private and protected. Let's say we wanted to protect the author name so its value cannot be changed outside of the context of this PHP class. Currently, we can update this class property outside of this context. If we go back to functions.php and go back to where these author instances are created, after this author1 assignment, let's go ahead and assign a new value to the name property using author1 arrow name, and we will set this equal to Steve Jobs. And if I save and refresh the page, Steve Jobs has replaced me in these blog articles. I don't ever want this to happen because over time, I may have a lot of code floating around and it may be impossible to really predict which PHP classes change or modify other PHP class properties. Because of this, we can add a restriction to any class property that makes sure this can't be done. Let's go back to the author class and let's change this class property to private. This completely changes the visibility of this class property so it cannot be accessed outside of the scope of this class. If we go ahead and refresh our page, we will get an error that tells us that it cannot access private property author name. This is exactly what we want. Let's check our functions.php file. And of course, this name assignment is now coming up as a reg squiggly saying the member has private visibility. Let's go ahead and remove this assignment of Steve Jobs. But you'll notice that this updated scope visibility is also affecting the output of these class properties. This is because this class property is now completely private. Since we now have no way to retrieve this name property directly with the arrow syntax, we need to create a new class method with a public visibility, which then retrieves the value of this property. Let's go to our author class and we will create a new public function named getName. This will be a function that returns a string. And within the body of this function, we will just return a call to this name. This refers to the class property name that's created within the constructor. This function is really simple. It just returns that class property. This means that we can now access the name property from outside of this class by calling this getName method. So let's go back to our functions.php file and update these calls to the name property to the method of getName. And we will do this with every reference within this file. Now, when we save and refresh the page, we can now see that PHP is properly returning the name class property by calling this public method. Scope essentially locks down how class properties are accessed outside of the context of a class. There is another scope visibility called protected that we won't get into right now, but know that it's a slightly more open scope and visibility than private, as it lets classes that extend other classes access these properties. Private locks it down so only direct instances of a class can access the property. Refactoring functions into PHP classes. We have this author class all set up, but we are still using this functions.php file, and it's pretty sloppy, so let's convert this into its own class. Within the classes directory, let's go ahead and create a new file named post.php. Let's create a PHP tag and declare strict types, create our class named post, and next we will copy the contents from this functions.php file over to this new post class. First comes this require statement that we will place at the top above our class definition. And then we will grab both of these functions, getPost and getPostText, and paste them into our post class. Each of these functions really should have a scope defined. The default scope is public, but it's still a good idea to explicitly define these scopes as public to make it very apparent that this actually is what we want to do. So let's add public before each of these function definitions. Next, we also need to update the function names. We can remove any reference to post within the function name. Since post is already implied by the class name of post, naming these functions with post within it is redundant. So let's rename getPosts to getAll. And going to getPostText, let's just rename this getText. This post class is a bit different from the author class, and we really don't need or want to instantiate this class. Because of this, we can also use the static keyword to define each of these as static functions. This means that we won't have to instantiate this class just to call one of its functions. We can just call the functions directly without instantiation. So after public, let's add static to each of these function signatures. And now that we copied all of the functionality out of the functions.php file, we can go ahead and delete it. We will also need to update the index.php file since it still references functions.php. So rather than including this file, we will include a reference to classes/post.php. Then we can update the references for both the posts and post text variables. Since getPost doesn't exist, we can call the post class. But since we don't need to instantiate this class, we can just call the public static functions we defined with 2 colons, followed by the name of the class, which would be getAll. And we can replace this second call with a call to post getText. And if we refresh our page, we can see everything still functions exactly the same, so everything still works. Defining and using PHP namespaces. Namespaces are simply a way for you to organize classes. When your code base gets much larger, namespaces can help you manage them. This can also help you out if you have multiple classes with the same name.
By default, PHP uses one single global namespace, so if you create two classes with the same name, they will actually conflict with one another. However, by defining namespaces in your classes, it helps compartmentalize your app into specific organizational groups, so the same class name can actually be used multiple times throughout your app as long as each one of them have their own namespace. You define a namespace simply with the namespace keyword, and it needs to be the first line in your PHP class. For example, let's say we wanted this author class to be in the app namespace. We can simply type namespace app, and now this author class belongs to the app namespace. Let's go back to the post class, and we will notice something interesting. The author class can actually not be found now. It's undefined, according to the PHP code. This is because this class is no longer in the global namespace, but rather in the app namespace. We can get things working again by actually prefixing this class with app/. And now PHP is able to resolve these two classes. And when we save and refresh, we can see that our app still works. This app author is known as the fully qualified class name. You may hear that term when you get deeper in your knowledge about classes in the future. Since we could have many references to our class within this file, it's probably a better idea to import this class at the top of the file, and then we can just reference it with author. So we could do this above our class name by typing use, which is essentially an import keyword, followed by the fully qualified class name. So this would be app/author. And this makes the author class available to this entire class. So we no longer need a reference to the namespace when we reference that class. We can also alias this class by adding in an as and then the alias of the class name. This could be useful if you are importing many classes and they share the same name, which does happen from time to time. So we can name this something like author alias, or even just another name, and then we can replace the calls to the class with the alias name. So when the alias is used in reference throughout your code, it will refer back to this app author class. But for now, we will just import it like a regular class is imported. Let's continue by adding a namespace to this post class. So let's add it to the same namespace as our author. So we will again use namespace app. So you will notice after typing that line that the import of the app author class is now grayed out. This is because both of these classes are now located in the same app namespace. Since they are at the same root of the same namespace, this import is unnecessary, as PHP will be aware of all classes in the same namespace. So we can remove this class import, and everything will still work. But finally, you will notice this post class is also grayed out. PHP Storm is telling us that this class is not currently being used. So if we go back to our index.php file, we will see that this post class is undefined for the same reason. It doesn't know how to locate this class. It looks in the global namespace, but it can't find it. So all we need to do is import this class with use app/post. And now this class is resolved. And a refresh of our page will confirm everything still works. Replace PHP require statements with the composer class autoloader. We are still manually importing files and classes all around our code with the require statements, but this isn't a common practice in modern PHP development once you start working with classes. It would be very cumbersome to manage, and hard-coded file paths will make your app a bit tough to maintain. Instead, you can use what's called a PHP autoloader. It's common to use Composer's dump autoload functionality to do this, so that's exactly what we're going to do to set this all up. If you don't already, be sure to install Composer, and you can confirm it's installed on your machine by running composer --version. If a version number is outputted, it tells you that it is installed. First, we need to instantiate a new composer.json file, which is used for composer configuration for this project. So if you don't already have one set up, you can run a new line called composer init. You'll have a lot of prompts come up. Let's just accept all the defaults. At the time of this lesson, there are 13 prompts. Just hit yes or enter for each one of these. After this is executed, you will wind up with a new composer.json file in the root of your project. So what we need to do is map the app namespace to the classes directory. This is very simple to do. The autoload is defined with something called PSR4 format. And all we need to do is reference the namespace within this property name. This will just be app/. When you have slashes within this config, you need to make sure to escape it. So a single slash becomes a double slash, just as it's represented here. And finally, the value of this namespace is mapped to the location that it can be found within our file system. This will be the classes subdirectory. By default, Composer looks at the source directory. We're not using this, so we can just remove it. And after this is done, let's save the file, and we need Composer to register the classes with the autoloader. This is very easy with command line. All we need to do is run composer dump-autoload. And this will generate all of the includes that we need for our namespace to be auto-imported. And now that this is all set up, we have one last step, and that is to remove all of these require statements. We could do this from all of our files, which at the moment are just the post and index.php files. And we only need one require now, and that will be the require from vendor/autoload.php. This kicks off the autoload process, which automatically imports all of the files with these other PHP files that are defined in the vendor/composer directory. So all we need to do is include that file with a require statement in the first file of our app, which is index.php. So let's type require, and the file we are requiring is at vendor/autoload.php. This is the only file we need to require in our app. So the autoloader will automatically require all of the classes that we call in our code with include or require statements. Now when we save and refresh our page, everything still works with one require statement. All of the classes that we are referencing in our app are automatically included by the autoloader. You may need to periodically run the composer dump autoload command when new root namespaces are being added to your code base.